There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Story of Us. So first, I'm gonna Zoom people. You hear me okay, right?
There we go.
I'm gonna apologize in advance if I am a little more unhinged than normal. I am very jet lagged right now, and my head is a cloud. So we'll see how this goes. But it's good to be with everyone.
You know you can end it at any time.
Yeah, we'll get going and it'll be
I
good.
know, but if you feel...
Thank you.
Josiah, there's a chair over here if you want.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so welcome back to Story of Us. We're going to do something a little different today. We're going to jump ahead in time because Hanukkah is starting. I sent an email about this. Hopefully you saw that. But just backing up for a moment. Welcome. We get the whole Hartman crew.
The library is afloat.
I was just at Hartman in Jerusalem, and now we have Hartman here. It's good. So just as a reminder of what Story of Us is and why we're doing it, and actually it felt very relevant being in Israel. Writ large, I think one of the other ways of saying the thesis of what we're doing is that Jews are not the people of the Torah. The Torah is the cultural product of Jews. I'm going to say that again, right? Mm-hmm. We are not a religious community of the Bible, even as that also is, I think, a frame and a truth of what it means to be a Jew. But instead that the Bible, and I'm going to go ahead and include actually most of Christian scriptures in that statement, that the Bible are cultural products of Jews. By the way, as we get further in history, we are going to go ahead and study Christian scriptures as Jewish texts. Because, of course, originally most of them, not all of them, but most of them in their original context are Jewish texts. Right? Not texts that are seen as being religious by the majority of Jews, but they are texts of a religious nature written by Jews primarily, again, not all of them, we're not talking necessarily all of Paul and things like that, but primarily for Jews. Yeah, Eric.
On that subject, is there an original Hebrew version of Maccabees?
Oh, yeah, so we're talking Maccabees today. So, no, scholars think that there was.
There had to have been.
Yeah. And there's some of the pieces in the books of Maccabees, and really we're talking multiple books of Maccabees. But that's what we're talking about today. So anyways, the Story of Us is our attempt to tell the story of who Jews have been and how we have understood ourselves. To really look at the story we have told ourselves about who we are and how that has changed in history. Make sense? Okay. So we'll do... So far, yeah, we'll see. Yeah. So the first few sessions that we've done, you could really understand as also being called Who Wrote the Bible, or Who Wrote the Torah, really early on. And we're going to go backwards. We're going to look at some of the prophetical texts over coming weeks and pieces like that. We looked at the very earliest people who thought of themselves as Jews. We looked at the folks living in what we now call the West Bank, in those mountainous regions, like 1250 BCE, who told themselves stories that look a lot like the Moses stories, that they were folks who had come from Egypt, from the great southern kingdom. We looked at the nomads living in the south, really a life that isn't so different than the Bedouins today, though the Bedouin tents today, as I just was reminded being in Israel, often have satellite dishes on the top of their tents now, which is just like a different kind of vibe, right? But the people in the south were really a different group of people in 1250. You had the stories of Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and so on and so forth, right? The matriarchs and the patriarchs. We looked at how around the year 1000, a southern tribal leader, warlord, is able to consolidate the various groups in the south, get declared the king over all of the south, and then become the occupier of the north, the evil, terrible occupier of the north. Of course, we are talking about King David here, right, which is a different frame of understanding King David, but we looked at the story of David in Bathsheba as actually being a northern polemic against the southern occupying king. So then we moved forward. We looked at the Assyrian invasion that happens in the 700s or so. We looked at the ways that it causes northerners to flee south as refugees, take residence primarily in Jerusalem, and the way that these stories merged together, the northern stories of Exodus, the southern stories of the matriarchs and patriarchs, which is to say how writ large, and I don't mean literally these texts, but these ideas of the book of Genesis and then the story of the Exodus merged together. And I believe last time, if I'm remembering correctly through my jet-lagged brain, we ended by thinking about Joseph as being the mythological bridge between these two bodies of mythology that otherwise actually are pretty disconnected, right? We get so used to reading it beginning with, well, Genesis 12, beginning with Abraham and going all the way through the Exodus narrative, that we miss how big of a break that is, that actually these are two separate bodies of mythology. We compared them last time, I think, to Star Trek and Star Wars. And we called Joseph the sort of comic book crossover where Captain Picard ends up with Darth Vader. Okay. Questions, thoughts on any of that? I think that's basically the quick summary of everything we've covered, right? We haven't done Josiah yet. No. Okay. So we ended at about the 750s. Seeing as Hanukkah is here, or almost here, on Thursday night,
Is there a chair over there?
So we've been,
we're going to jump forward, and we are going to talk about the story of Hanukkah. We're going to talk about it in its original context, but we're also going to talk about it in its social context today. So first, a little bit of a trivia question. Anyone know what is the last book of the Hebrew Bible to be written? The last book that makes the cut. There are, of course, other books that don't make the cut, but the last book that makes the cut. What's the latest book? Yeah, exactly. Unless you were just saying my name, but you know, yeah, it's the Book of Daniel. And the Book of Daniel, we can see this in all sorts of different ways. The Book of Daniel is written in two different languages. It's Hebrew and it's Aramaic, showing that we're living in a Jewish world post-Babylonian exile. Again, we'll get there in a couple weeks when we return back to our normal timeline. But 586 BCE is the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian invasion, and is really the end of Hebrew being the daily language of the Jewish people until the modern Israeli state, or the modern Zionist movement.
what years?
586 BCE. 586 BCE, the Jews of Israel, the leadership are carted off into exile, into Babylon, and Jews continue to live in Jews continue to live in what comes to be known as Babylon or Iraq or Iran at various times. We're talking about different places, Persia, for the next 2,500 years or so, until the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when this population is almost entirely ethnically cleansed and makes its way to Israel. Today, something about 70% of the Jewish population in Israel are Arab Jews, Jews from Arab lands, Muslim lands, not exclusively Arab because we're also talking Morocco and Iran, but about 53% of the total population of Israel is made up of these folks. So that's where we're talking about with the Babylonian exile, but that is the moment that Hebrew stops being the daily language of Jews until the modern Zionist movement.
And the daily language became?
Aramaic, by and large, during this time, and eventually Greek, and then there's some Latin added in later. But Aramaic and its various pieces, and actually Aramaic is a body of languages as much as it is a single language. There's Eastern Aramaic and Western Aramaic, and then we're talking hundreds and then thousands of years, so the languages develop significantly. But so the Book of Daniel is written half in Hebrew, half in Aramaic, and it is also two different genres. It is sort of the stories of Daniel, these sort of pieces that look like, almost like the stories of Genesis a little bit, and then we have these wild apocalyptic visions that kind of look like the Book of Revelation. And I actually think you can understand the Book of Revelation and these parts of Daniel as being a part of a literary tradition of apocalyptic narratives that happened during this time. Okay, we're not really going to go into too much depth on Daniel, other than what is the Book of Daniel about? What is the political moment that it's talking about? Anyone know? So nominally it's talking about the Babylonian exile. But the Book of Daniel is talking about the Assyriac Greek occupation. It's talking about the story of the Maccabees. It's a political book written at a moment when talking about the contemporary politics of Greek occupation or Syriac Greek occupation of Israel would have been bad for your health, let's say. So it's written in code, and instead it's written as being a part of the Babylonian experience. But we actually can date the book of Daniel when it's finished because it gets basically everything right in the story until how the Greek king dies. It gets that wrong. So we know almost exactly when the book of Daniel is completed because of that. Okay. So, whatever you think you know about the Maccabees, I want you to throw out.
Like I talk about King David.
I know, like,
You thought you knew
this
what
is
he was
even
like?
crazier than King David, though, because I think the closest analog to the Maccabees is probably ISIS. Okay, so, taking you back in time. Now we're in the 2nd century BCE. What's happened is Alexander the Great has come in. We've had this series of people who have come and controlled, and we're gonna talk about some of these revolutions in coming weeks. Right, we've talked about the Assyrian invasion, but then you get the Babylonians, and the Babylonians turn into the Persians, and eventually you get Alexander the Great, who comes through. And what's different about Alexander the Great from just about all of these other occupying forces is that he believed he was civilizing the world and was bringing Greek culture to everywhere he went. Hellenism, right, is of course the term. And actually this seems to be, unfortunately, a symptom that has existed long after Alexander the Great, right? We're talking about sort of cultural colonialism and imperialism here and the imposition of foreign cultures on the attempt to civilize the natives and all of these sort of terrible things that we're used to from history. But this is what Alexander the Great does. And he starts building these Greek cultural institutions everywhere that he goes. So this is how we end up with universities in Israel, the academies. This is how we end up with the bathhouses. The bathhouses, by the way, become very popular with the rabbis, who, even though the bathhouses have all of these idols in them, the rabbinic tradition is able to work out a way that it's okay for us to go to the sauna, really. Actually, by the way that they do it is they say, well, they don't really mean these things as gods, because after all, everyone defecates in front of them, and you wouldn't defecate in front of your god, so we can go into the baths. Really, that's the Talmud. They talk about poop just a lot in the Talmud, way more than you would imagine, genuinely. We are recording this session. Yeah, don't worry. We're recording it right now, and it'll be available on YouTube. And I'm not doing it through Zoom. It's a different recording. Okay. So we get the gymnasiums. And in fact, does anyone remember the typical uniform in the gymnasiums? Yeah. Yeah. Entirely different concepts. Mikvah is a ritual pool to immerse in. A bathhouse in the ancient Greek world is like a sauna.
Was it just the
But when
guys?
did they recognize?
Probably.
Different.
Yeah, mikvahs are totally don't
separate.
think mikvah at all here. Totally
Didn't come
separate.
from there.
No, it doesn't come from there. Mikvah is an
Thank
entirely
you.
separate idea that we'll deal with that later.
The uniform was no uniform.
The uniform was no uniform. In the Greek gymnasiums, you were
Right.
famously naked. Okay.
And male.
And male, yes, that's a really important piece.
Got that.
The gymnasiums were for men, which is to say people with penises at that time, which is to say it was really obvious who was Greek and who was Jewish. Okay. I mention this because one of the pieces of evidence we have, archaeological evidence, is that there were all sorts of attempts to undo circumcision during this time period. It involves like weights and stones and ropes, and I don't totally understand it, but I'm choosing not to deal too deeply into that.
Someone I can talk to.
Yeah, it's a really.
Just
It's,
kidding.
but
Somewhere involved.
I mention it because I think it shows the extent of the pressure for assimilation that is happening at this moment. Now, one of the things that we see is that pressure for assimilation is different in the urban centers than it is in the rural areas, which I think makes sense, right? And so in the urban centers, in the cities, we see these academies, we see these gymnasiums, we see the bathhouses, we see Greek culture, and we see assimilation. And that assimilation is not understood entirely as negative. In many ways, it's seen as positive. But in the same way that today in the Jewish world, Jewish American world, often assimilation is used as a bad word, right? But you talk to American Jews 2 or 3 generations ago, and it was the explicit goal, right? It was the positive. We were trying to assimilate. And similarly, a lot of these folks in these urban settings understood themselves as becoming civilized with all of the problematics of that notion. Okay. We start to see an increasing divide between these Jews or Judeans who are living in rural areas and those who are living in the urban centers. And a real sense that the real Jews are in the rural areas, and the cosmopolitan globalists are in the cities.
Sound familiar?
No, right? And I'm using this language on purpose,
Yeah.
obviously. Right? It's the sort of Sarah Palin didn't show up in St. Louis when she wanted to see the real Missourians,
Right.
right? And this is the idea then too. And we start to see this divide increasing and increasing and increasing. Meanwhile, Alexander the Great dies. The kingdom ends up divided into a number of different pieces. What we would now call Israel ends up a part of the Assyriac Greek kingdom or empire or state, or don't push too hard on what the political words are because they don't quite fit with our current understandings. And the leadership of Israel isn't foreign Greeks. It's assimilated, urban, cosmopolitan, globalist Jews. So, by the way, to give it away here, Hanukkah is not the story of Jewish independence from the Greeks. Hanukkah is the story of Jewish civil war between
Rural.
Hellenized urban Jews and fundamentalist rural Jews. So
Never ends.
there's a group coming, right, never ends, exactly. So there's a group that ends up forming in some of the rocky rural areas northwest of Jerusalem, an area today known as Modi'in. Has anyone been to Modi'in? It's the new city of Israel. I think it's actually the 2nd or 3rd largest city by population in Israel now, maybe the 3rd after Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It was an intentionally planned city. Rabin of blessed memory is the one who put it into action. And today it's a thriving, growing urban center, but also a place that within 45 minutes, particularly now that the new rail system is up, and oh my God, the new rail system's wonderful, you can be at work in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem in 45 minutes or so. So it really works nicely. But it's also a place where, 2,200 years ago, a group of Jews, rural Jews opposed to the Greek occupation and or the assimilationist Jewish leadership in Jerusalem, begin waging a guerrilla war against the urban areas. So, in fact, what ends up happening is that these Jews, and we have this from the various books of Maccabees, these folks go from town to town. They stop and they gather all of the men of the town. They strip them naked. They forcibly circumcise anyone who is not circumcised. And any of the young boys of teenage age, they cart off and turn into child soldiers as they go from town to town to town, enforcing a fundamentalist Jewish rule. That's why I sort of compared them a little bit to ISIS earlier. Don't push too hard on that, but right there is an element of this that we see there. Okay, eventually, by the way, they are able to capture political control. and their big issue is that they believe that the wrong people, this is at least the way that they frame it, the wrong people are in charge of the temple. It's the corrupt, people who go along with the Greeks who are in charge of the temple instead of the real priests, the descendants of Aaron. And so, of course, they immediately put in their own people in charge of the temple, not the correct people, but in fact their own people in charge of the temple. And we'll get to this in a month or two in Story of Us. But they are so corrupt that we have letters written by Jews to the Romans begging the Romans to come and invade. Not back, to come. Please come liberate us from the corrupt Hasmoneans. And if you've studied with me enough, you've heard me make this joke, but it never gets old, that I like to say that the Hasmoneans were the most corrupt Jewish administration until the Netanyahu administration. The thing about Bibi being the longest serving prime minister now is really, I've been using this joke for 25 years. Okay. So this is the real story of the Hasmoneans. This is the real story of the Maccabees. Closing that door, thank you. So before we start talking contemporary moments and what we've done with these stories, any thoughts, any questions, anything on this?
What's the name of that?
Yeah, please, Paul. So we're really pre-rabbinic at this time. There's really no such thing as rabbinic Judaism at this point. Maybe the very earliest antecedents to the rabbinic tradition are there, but by and large, no. Now, there would have been the Greek gymnasiums. There would have been places of Torah study. The Torah certainly would have been codified and finished and formalized by this point. The books of the prophets would have been circulating and finished and canonized. But not yeshivas as we imagine it today. In any rabbis that were there, or any sort of antecedents to the rabbinic tradition, maybe called Pharisees at this point too, are so fringy that they are nowhere near the power centers. Good question. Mary and then Sarah. I don't know the answer to that. I would assume so, seeing as it's Greek culture, but I don't know the answer to that. I know the Romans end up building theaters, but yeah, good question. I'll do some Googling. When we come back around to this history in a month or so, maybe I'll have an answer. Sarah. Aramaic would have been the day-to-day language for most people, with Greek being a secondary language and Hebrew being almost exclusively a... yeah, it's not quite the right word because the social concepts of religion are so different. The Psalms certainly are a part of a liturgy. There certainly would have been temple practices. There's the emergence of the earliest pre-synagogues during this time period as well, probably. But not a liturgy that we would recognize. There wasn't an Amidah. There wasn't. Maybe you get the Shema by then. Of course, the Shema. Yeah, the Torah is done. The Torah exists by this point. Does not exist. Correct. Maybe the Shema. The Shema is, of course, a collection of biblical texts that are smashed together to create something new. And the earliest liturgies that we have are all like that. They're not original pieces like the Amidah or like some of the pieces around the Shema, Yotzer Or, Ma'ariv Aravim, Hashkidenu, all of those. But instead, they're these biblical mashups that people make to create new meaning. And that's what the Shema is. Right? The Shema is a collection of different texts from Deuteronomy with a text from Numbers and all put together to create something new. Texts like Ashrei might have been there too. So there would have been yes is the answer. There would have been lots of different versions of Jewish practice, but again, remember that during this time period, Jewish identity is almost entirely an ethnic identity or a tribal identity or a national identity that has a religious practice, but what we would now call religious practice would not have been the identifying feature of what it meant to be a Jew. I'd also suggest it isn't today either, but that's a different conversation. Helene. Yes, great question. No, so that's where we ended a couple weeks ago was the dispersion of the North and the Northern tribes in the 750s or so BCE. That's really the end of the 10 tribes. Particularly by this time, we're talking 500 years or so after that. And we're talking post-Babylonian exile and then return. So the tribal identities would have been lost outside of Kohen, Levite, and then everyone else is simply known as Israel, right? Israelites, the collection of them. I can't remember, by the way, if I've mentioned this, but sorry, my jet lag is thick, but Kohens, the priestly tribe, is still identifiable in the haplotype of something like 60% of people who have a tradition of being Kohens have the exact same paternal haplotype, which means they go back to the same male line ancestor, which is just wild to think about, right? My grandpa always said that we were Kohens. My dad thought he was full of it because grandpa liked to, be a macher. And then I did 23andMe, and that's my haplotype, which is just
Fascinating.
really.
It does show up in 23andMe.
This is way pre-Ashkenazi, right? Yes, and the Kohens in all of these communities share that haplotype. Because, of course, Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, despite the fact that they have additional interminglings with the communities that they're a part of over the years, sometimes more voluntarily than not, they still are a part of the same original ethnic group, and you can see this through the haplotype broadly.
Haplotype is a genetic readout of
Yeah, sure. They call themselves Kohens. Yeah, sure. You find. You could be a Sephardi Kohen or a Mizrahi Kohen who lived in Turkey. Yeah. Haplotype, paternal haplotype is a genetic marker that goes through your fathers on that line. Yeah, one of the identifiable pieces. And there's also maternal haplotype. There's all sorts but this is one of the things that we see. Okay, so going back to these Hasmoneans. We have a sense of who they were now, right? We have a... So I want to jump to our present moment instead and to talk about this holiday of Hanukkah. Yeah.
Can you say something how they got their name? Why are they called Hezbollah?
I don't remember right now.
Sorry.
If I wasn't so jet lagged, I might
later.
remember this answer, but
Sorry.
yeah, it's the family that ends up in control. But yeah, King Herod is a part of it. I mean, it goes on for a while. But okay, so today there are 3 groups of people who have claimed Hanukkah as their own. The 3 groups of Jews, primarily. 500 years ago, Hanukkah was a no big deal holiday. Lag BaOmer, Tisha B'Av, Tu B'Shvat, Hanukkah. That's sort of where Hanukkah sits. If you go back even 200 years, 150 years ago, 150 years ago, Hanukkah, you get a little piece of chocolate or a little piece. That's what right? Like you get a little something. It wasn't a big holiday at all. In fact, right, that what it really was in some ways was an observance of the winter solstice. Hanukkah, and here's a nice just sort of teaching about Hanukkah, separate by the way, is that Hanukkah is always the darkest week of the year because it's Hanukkah, unlike most Jewish holidays, starts on the 25th. Very easy to remember because Christmas, right? Hanukkah starts on the 25th of Kislev. The Jewish month begins on the new moon, which means that Hanukkah goes on both sides of the new moon. So it is the week with the least amount of moonlight that comes closest to the winter solstice, which is to say it is the week in the year that has the least amount of light, in which our obligation is to bring more light. As long as we're talking, isn't that nice, right?
Yeah,
and it's just
nice.
sort of true, and it always sort of feels like it comes at the right time when we need a little more light in the world. The other Hanukkah teaching, and this is separate from really what we're doing in this session, but just another nice teaching. This comes from my Rebbe, David Hartman of a blessed memory. That when you look at it, someone mind grabbing that door. When you look at it, Hanukkah should be how many days?
8.
7 days. Why should it be 7 days? Why 7 and not 8?
Well, all the extra days are because we're not in Israel. That's what I
okay,
always taught,
okay.
But I don't know.
Yeah, right. For a lot of holidays, we add extra days.
Right.
Hanukkah actually doesn't get extra days outside
Isn't
of
that
Israel.
extra candle for
They have 8 days in Israel, don't they?
They have 8 days in
Yeah.
Israel, but the reason Hanukkah doesn't get an extra day, unlike these other things, is because Hanukkah is not a holiday. It's not a chag, right? It's actually just, that's how small and unimportant it is.
Okay.
But what's the miracle of Hanukkah?
The oil
The light.
lasted.
The oil lasted.
Days.
How long was the oil supposed to last?
One,
So
the 7 extra.
there's only 7 days of miracles.
Right.
By the way, it's a second-class miracle. Like my cell phone lasts for 8. Actually, that'd be a good right. Like, but it's a second-class miracle. It should be a 7-day holiday. The first day was supposed to last. So,
I like that.
what is it? What is it that we observe? Why is it that we observe Hanukkah for 8 days? Why is it that we observe Hanukkah? It's because in an uncertain world, we had the chutzpah to light the candles anyways, to light the oil anyways. So anyways, that's the Hanukkah teaching. Okay, actually, I should have gone back and talked to the Romans also. Let's do that before we talk contemporary times. This is my jet lag right here.
But one thing.
Yeah, please.
You said that it's a minor holiday 150 years ago, but in Israel, when I was in Israel in the 80s, it was also not a big deal.
It's become bigger, but yeah.
Yeah, but back then it wasn't.
It's not such a big deal. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Totally not a big deal.
Pajamas.
Okay, hold on. Let's pause on this. I want to go back to the Romans, though. Were you going to say something?
Is there a place in 1 Maccabees where Judah says, says that we will celebrate this for 8 days?
I don't think
When
so.
they decide to make it a holiday.
So let's talk about what happens to Hanukkah, because Hanukkah itself, right? Very quickly after the Hasmoneans, we talked about this. The Romans come, and the Romans are brutal, and we have these rebellions. We're going to spend a lot of time on these rebellions. We have 3 major rebellions. We have a rebellion in 68. We're on our side of 0 now. We have a rebellion around the year 100 or so that is disastrous throughout the empire. And then we have a rebellion in the 130s known as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. These are disastrous for Jews. And there is a real belief amongst the rabbis by the time we get into the year 200 our time, our side of 0, that if there's any more rebellions against Rome, it'll just be the end of us. To show you how inspirational these people were, by the way, look at the Christian scriptures written, around this time period. And you have multiple Judases. Those are people named after Judah Maccabee.
Oh.
It's a nationalistic name. So the rabbis are incredibly concerned that the story of the Maccabees can be used to inspire rebellion against Rome again, which will destroy us. So if you open up the Talmud, you don't get the stories of 1 Maccabees or 2 Maccabees. You don't get the stories of Jewish civil war or conquering of the Greek occupiers or any of the various tellings. Instead, what do you get? You get a children's story. You get the story of oil lasting, right? It's really, we get so used to it. It's such a third-class miracle that we're dealing with here, of these oil lasting this long period. But you can't be inspired to rebellion against Rome by oil lasting a long time. Okay, we framed that. That was an important frame for us to jump today. So today there are three groups of people who really focus on Hanukkah. Let's name them. Who are they?
Americans.
American Jews, Israelis,
Israelis.
and who's the third distinct group who loves Hanukkah?
South Africa?
No? Not a geography. This is a Jewish movement.
Christians.
Chabad.
Ah,
Chabad.
Oh, they do.
They love Hanukkah. It's
They
their
do.
holiday.
It's their holiday.
It's their holiday. Everywhere you...
Hannukah-edition, that's them.
The Hanukkah is out, in fact, in public, right? They're
Yeah.
really
Menorah.
good.
Really public, really
the
big.
big menorah is there.
The big menorahs that they put up in public places,
Yeah.
that they convince all of the politicians to come and light. I
Right.
guarantee you Governor Parsons is lighting a Chabad Hanukkah on Thursday somewhere.
Yeah.
Guarantee you. Just as almost every governor in our country is probably lighting a Chabad Hanukkah. Our Mayor Jones is probably be invited to light a Chabad Hanukkah. They're really good at this, and it's what they do, and it's what they focus on. So
Okay.
that's where we're going now.
Oh, good.
So we have three different narratives of Hanukkah that these three different groups tell. So let's start with American Jews, first of all.
Oh, that's easy.
What's the story of Hanukkah for us? What is this a holiday that celebrates?
We do 8 days of presents.
We do 8 days of
Right.
How
presents.
much,
Okay.
we can be more commercial than you
We
are.
can, right? Like we took all of the worst
Absolutely.
parts of Christmas and turned it into Hanukkah for sure. I also want to suggest that actually what that means is that Hanukkah is a celebration of Jewish at-homeness in America. I have lots of Muslim friends, imams, who have talked about how jealous they are of Hanukkah. There's no Muslim holiday, there's no Islamic holiday that you can buy things for in the grocery store. We are, 1.5% of America, and every Target is going to have that blue and white shelf right by.
Yep.
And we
Ins-
have somebody, Hobby Lobby, somebody.
Hobby, everyone, right?
No, they're not.
No.
Oh, they're not. Wow, not happy holidays, just Merry Christmas. Okay. But Hanukkah becomes a celebration of Jewish American sense that you don't have to choose between your Jewishness and your Americanness. I want to put aside contemporary politics and what people are feeling, right? Like, because this is actually profoundly true. And so, in some ways, Hanukkah, for Jewish Americans, is the holiday of the First Amendment. It's a celebration of religious freedom. And the story that we tell about Hanukkah, the story we teach in our Shabbat schools, and that if we grew up Jewish, we probably grew up learning, was that this is a holiday about a bunch of Jews who wanted to practice their faith and weren't allowed to practice their faith and fought for their religious freedom so that they could, practice. That's how we are taught this story. When we get way farther into the story of us, we're going to talk about the ways that Jewish identity in America turns into a religious identity rather than an ethnic identity as a way of Ashkenazi Jews becoming white. That makes sense just on a, we're not going to go into too much detail because we're going to deal with it. But we turn this into a faith, right? We can be Americans, which is to say white Americans, of the Hebrew faith. And so Hanukkah becomes the celebration of that we can practice our faith, the First Amendment, here in the United States.
Because decades ago we were called not a faith, but
Can you keep
a
your
race.
voice in?
A
I'm
race,
sorry.
an ethnicity, a tribe. We're going to deal with that later, the social constructs, when we get to sort of the American Jewish experience. But yeah, exactly. Okay, does this make sense? I think we're all familiar with this, right?
Is, Is that where the putting the candles in the window?
No, that's ancient.
That's ancient.
That's
okay.
ancient. Yep, that goes back to the Talmud. Yep.
It works.
Okay, any thoughts on this? Zoom people, any thoughts? Are we... Okay. That's group number 1, American Jews. Group number 2, Israelis.
Kol Bachor Tov L'Neshek.
What's the story of Hanukkah?
Every boy is good with weapons.
The story of Hanukkah is the story of Jewish nationalism.
Okay.
It's the story of Jews overthrowing our foreign oppressors and once again becoming a free people in our own land. For Israelis, Hanukkah is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day from 2,200 years ago. Makes sense, right? By the way, it's kind of funny to think about it for a second, because Americans turn this into a celebration of American Jews into religious freedom when we're talking about fundamentalists who went around enforcing their religion on everyone else, right? And Israelis talk about it as a celebration of Jewish nationalism and Jewish independence, when in fact it was much closer to a Jewish civil war than anything. But again, this goes with our broad theme of Story of Us, which is that we always tell the Jewish story in a way that serves us where we are. That's the whole idea of myth as opposed to history. Okay, these two groups make sense, right? So in some ways, Chabad is the most authentic of them all. I don't mean as a movement. They're radically inauthentic, actually, as a Jewish movement. Even as they sell Jewish authenticity, Chabad and ultra-Orthodoxy is a radically new invention in Jewish history. There has never before been such concentrated conservatism into a group as there is in ultra-Orthodoxy, and it is as radical and innovative as Reform Judaism is, without question. But maybe in their celebration of Hanukkah, they actually are the most authentic. Because what is Chabad's mission? Does anyone know?
Bring everyone back in the fold, all Jews back.
Not just into the fold, but
In
keep
the
going.
Conservative fold.
Into the lowercase c
Yeah.
conservative
Yeah.
fold, right?
Their particular fold.
And into their
Yes.
particular fold. So for those who don't know,
They want you to wrap to fill in.
they want you to wrap to fill in. They want, right? They go. In fact, when I was in Israel, I was out with friends on a Friday for breakfast, and there was a Chabad person coming by handing out little candles for women to light at night. So, by the way, it's one of the things that I love about Israel is that there's a place in the world where the religious crazies are us rather than like a different group. No, really, right? Like,
Right.
I just they're still the religious crazies, but
And they're still scary.
yeah, for sure. But they're Jewish versions
they're
of those
scary.
things, right? It's what Bialik said, that his dream. Oh, hold on, Sarah. The Bialik's dream was that there be a place where Jewish police officers could be arresting Jewish criminals, which is to say, a place where Jewish life was just normative. The Yiddish, yeah, there you go. Yeah, we're gonna talk Chabad. That's where we're going right now. So Chabad is proselytizing, just not to non-Jews.
Right.
They're just proselytizing to Jews. Chabad, by and large, when you start digging at them, by and large, they believe that their last Rebbe, their last chief rabbi, was the Messiah. By the way, Schneerson, of a blessed memory, was pretty incredible by all accounts. And there is a recording of a meeting in Israel between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi chief rabbi who were like this close to coming out and announcing that Schneerson was the Mashiach. Like, really? This is a real thing, right? Isn't that just crazy? But so Schneerson dies, and today there are essentially 3 types of Chabad theology. I'm going to be really dismissive here, I'm sorry. There's the Jesus Chabadniks, there's the Elvis Chabadniks. The Jesus Chabadniks believed that he died and is coming back, and the Elvis Chabadniks believed that the king never died. And in fact, you see the signs all over that Melech HaMashiach lives in Israel. And you see it on 170.
Yeah.
Have people seen the
I've
sign?
I've seen
Yes.
it.
I was driving home from the airport the other day to my parents, and like,
Yeah.
where was I? That there's this big billboard
Yes.
about the Messiah is here from Chabad. And then there's a third group who have come to the idea that actually Schneerson was a manifestation of God. So you may, by the way, some of these feel a little Christian, which I think is actually a nice example of the fact that theology has very little to do with Jewish identity. Right? You can be an atheist Jew, you can believe that Schneerson was the Messiah and is coming back, and all of these are acceptable Jewish heresies.
Acceptable by who?
Well, I think by the broad consensus,
Yeah.
very few Jews would say that those beliefs disqualify you from Jewishness. We may look at each other and say that's ridiculous, and that's what we can all agree on, is that when we look at each other, we think the other ones are ridiculous, but right.
We could call it fringe, but we'd still call it Jewish fringe.
Right.
Yes, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Also.
And.
And.
Chabad famously does not get along with other Jewish institutions. Talk to Jewish leadership in almost any city, and there's tensions with Chabad. And I think the reason is that Chabad's mission is different. Chabad hands out those candles, asks Yidrap to fill in, because they believe they're going to bring about the coming of the Messiah by getting all Jews to be like them. Which is to say, they're in the business of messianism and bringing the Messiah instead of the business of community, which is the real business that most Jewish institutions are in, which is why you end up with these tensions. But, yep. Oh, for sure. And actually, you find wonderful Chabad rabbis and wonderful Chabad manifestations and classes, and yeah, absolutely, that's really important. And when I lived in North India on a study abroad, there was a synagogue there because of Chabad, and there was a place to go for Shabbat because of Chabad. Right? We weren't Reform Jews weren't sending rabbis to Dharamsala, India, but they have a different purpose. I guess that's my real point here. And that is to get all Jews to be like them. Which actually, Rodi, that's part of why Chabad classically doesn't like to say you're a Reform Jew, you're a conservative Jew. We're all Jews is their way of saying, and we can all be like us.
You can practice however you want.
No, they don't. No,
They
you
don't-
can't
no.
practice however you want. There's a proper way to practice.
Oh, but
But they'll
to
accept
join
you.
You're
Oh
accepted
yeah,
no matter.
yeah. And Chabad's great at accepting you no matter what, as long as your mother was Jewish.
Right.
By their
Otherwise-
definition.
Yeah, but go to a college campus and watch as they have the lulav and the etrog and a sukkah, and each kid comes up and they ask the kid whether or not their mom's Jewish. So there are these things, right? But again, they're in the business of trying to get Jews, and I'm being overly dismissive of them, but of trying to get Jews to be like them. And so in that sense, they're the most authentic to Hanukkah. Because what is Hanukkah? If not the story of a bunch of religious fundamentalists trying to get all Jews to be like them. Okay. These were our 3 stories of Hanukkah. We have the original group, and then we have the 3 manifestations today. And this, so much, I think, is the story of us in a nutshell. Because we don't need to resolve which of these interpretations of Hanukkah is correct or right. And I actually think if we go back and try to just do the history, if instead we just talk about the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees as a model of ice, there's no meaning there. It doesn't give us light in the darkness. And instead, the way that the Jewish story always works is that we retell the past into our own image. American Jews, Israeli Jews, Chabadniks. Okay, that's sort of our content for today. So questions, thought. I hope this made sense. I can tell that I'm a little more unhinged than normal with my jet lag, and I feel like I'm floating in the ether right now. But yeah,
Can you tell us a little bit about when and First and Second Maccabees were written and who wrote them? And I assume because of what you said about worried about having more revolutions, that's why it wound up in the Apocrypha and not in the Bible.
yeah. So we're going to get to the Apocrypha again as we go forward in the story of us. For those who don't know, the Apocrypha is a collection of Jewish texts that don't make the cut of the Hebrew Bible, and then are not a part of Christian scriptures. But so the Catholic Church, I believe, includes the Apocrypha, a whole collection of these texts in its Bible, whereas many Protestant traditions do not. I think that's correct, what I just said. And so,
I think the Episcopalians do in their Bible.
yes, that makes sense because the Episcopalians come from a Catholic tradition rather than a traditionally Protestant tradition. So there are multiple books of Maccabees. There are multiple tellings of this story. But they don't end up being included in the Hebrew Bible. Why? Anyone know? Anyone have a thought?
Is it what you said before? That they were worried it would get us to have more rebellions and get wiped out?
Maybe. Actually, maybe. Yeah. Yeah. But there's another reason too. Okay, they're not in Hebrew, though there's some views, we were talking about this right at the very beginning, that suggest that these texts originally were in Hebrew or perhaps in Aramaic, or even as I believe it's the Greek copies that we have. But Daniel's half in Aramaic, and that ends up in the Hebrew Bible. So I think the key is... So yes, except for the fact that we're probably 300 years later, and past a Roman occupation and a few rebellions. So I think those politics were probably unimportant by that point to people, just not relevant. But
Too
good
Greek.
thought.
Too much Greek in there?
So I think part of it is this human nature that says that things that happened recently are regular and things that happened in the past are sacred. And the story of the Maccabees was just too recent. We looked at those books, or the people who were canonizing the Hebrew Bible, and we'll talk about them, it's the early rabbis, looked at the story of the Maccabees and said, oh, that's just recent history. And looked at these books and said, these are history, but these are scripture. They're not sacred, which is why Daniel, which is actually about the Maccabees, even though it doesn't look like it's about the Maccabees, makes the cut, and the books of Maccabees themselves do not. And the various stories, the various books of Maccabees have different tellings of the story itself. And they fit to the politics of the groups who are writing this, whether they want to articulate it as a civil war or as Greek rebellion or all of these pieces. Okay, other questions?
So with all of this in mind, what do you tell non-Jewish people? What is Hanukkah? What is it about?
What is Hanukkah about?
We get to do it in our
It's
own
about eating
generation.
latkes.
What?
With freedom
The
of
food
speech.
and the dreidel and the...
Yeah,
Light in the darkness.
that's what I was going to say.
Right.
Light in the darkness.
It's the winter solstice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Right, we didn't even talk about the idea that it's a second Sukkot and all of these things, which is another way of looking at Hanukkah. But yeah, light in the darkness would be my answer. And that's the piece that's the thread through all of these stories, by the way, is that all of these groups understood themselves as light in the midst of darkness. Other thoughts, other questions, other... Yes, was that Carol who said that?
You did.
Yeah, right. And that's because Judith is a part of the Apocrypha, so it doesn't end up a part of the normative Jewish tradition. But Judith is really like if you'll excuse me, a badass heroine of the Jewish tradition. I would say up there with Yael, who takes the tent peg and puts it through the general's head. Yeah, Judith. In fact, Judith is used a lot in art. You'll
Yes.
see her
Renaissance.
holding up the head, right?
Renaissance art.
Yeah, for sure. Good question, Elliot. Yeah.
He thinks we're not in the mainstream?
Yeah. So the narrative that I'm presenting, not as this narrative, but the individual pieces are absolutely the ways in the things that rabbis for the last 100 years outside of the Orthodox world have learned. There's nothing controversial about what I am saying or presenting in any of the individual pieces. I would say what is distinctive about what I'm doing is I am presenting the entirety of Jewish history as, again, how we started today, that the Bible is the product of Jews, not that Jews are the product of the Bible, even though, of course, it's symbiotic and through time and space and so on and so forth. This is a fundamentally religious, theological presentation of Jewish history that we are doing here. We are looking at Jewish religiosity as a manifestation of Jewish culture in the ways that it is different in different times and places. Whereas traditionally in our Sunday schools, B'nai Emunah, CRC, wherever, we are teaching a particular frame of Jewish religiosity. So I think the goals are different of these. Right? This is not what I would teach to third graders, but it is maybe what I teach to ninth graders. I actually think we should teach this more to ninth graders. I think this is a different, that's a different.
It's a critical thought process that would be very good for them.
Yeah, and the other piece is the idea of Jewish identity being primarily a religious identity is an American Jewish phenomenon of the last century or so, even less than that. And we're living in a world where increasingly people who fit into the American Jewish category are not interested in traditional religiosity. And so I think presenting a vision of what it means to be a Jew that is not based on faith is a powerful way of helping people understand themselves, helping the next generation understand themselves. And I deeply believe it is authentically Jewish. In some ways more authentically Jewish than the notion of Judaism as a faith. But the other thing that I would say is the other idea here is that we're rejecting the whole notion of authenticity altogether. So, okay, other questions?
I tried to explain to a CYC member, person that's very open-minded, that the story that we are taught is not exactly what happened. About the miracle of the oil. That was their biggest. It was Israel's biggest export was olive oil. There's olive oil everywhere. They could have found oil. And this person got so.
This is good. This is like a Marxist interpretation of Hannukah. This is good. I like this.
And this person got really mad at me.
Yeah. When we base our identity on these things, challenges to how we understand it feel like challenges to ourselves. I think it's why people respond so passionately and problematically about Israel, too, is that so many people understand Israel as a part of themselves, and so critiques of Israel feel like critiques of us often. Thomas, and then the Yushitels. Book recommendations about Hanukkah. No, nothing off the top of my head, but I'll think about that. I wish I did. Good question. You should tell us.
As a kid's story or as an adult?
What about first and
Oh,
second?
Thomas, I'm sorry. Did you have something else? Sorry, I see you're still.
How about first and second Maccabees?
Yeah, you can go read Maccabees. Yeah, go open up a
They're
Christian
worth reading.
Catholic Bible to read Maccabees, Jewish texts. Safaria has them too. Yeah. You should tell us. Yeah. I'll give you all three again. Right? For American Jews, Hanukkah is the story of religious freedom. It's the First Amendment holiday. Practice our faith. For Israeli Jews, it's July 4th. It's Independence Day. It's Jewish national uprising. It's to be a free people in our own land.
With our own hands.
With our own hands. With our own weapons. And for Chabad, it is sort of the victory of religious, they would not articulate it as fundamentalism over assimilation, but maybe they would the second part of that, the victory over assimilation of Jewish religiosity. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Any other last thoughts? So we will be back next week to our regularly scheduled timeline. Yes, so we're going to jump back in time, but I thought it would be good to do something on Hanukkah today.
Thank you.
That's great.
See y'all soon.
Thank you.
How are you? Thank you.
Super peach and wonderful, of course. Is there another way of
Pretty good.
Do you decorate your unicorn out in front of your house?
Am I going to decorate my unicorn? It's as decorated as it's getting.
I see.
Haven't been by your house to see your unicorn. Unicorn?
We'll come anytime. I don't have a good picture of it. I have a bad picture of it.
Rabbi,
Huh?
Is it new?
do other Jews